Hello and welcome to our second as yet unnamed episode of our horror movie review.
Still unnamed.
Yes, we haven't figured out quite a name for it yet, but this is, of course, the show where Jordan and I, Patrick, review horror movies that we've watched. And this episode, we're going to do something that I think is kind of interesting, kind of fun. We are going to frame this as kind of a debate, a sort of debate discussion on the relative merits of two great horror movie studios. Universal Studios and...
The American Universal Studios.
Yep, and the British Hammer... What do they call them? Hammer Films. Hammer Productions. Films. Yeah, so two great studios who've put out a lot of great horror movies, classic, wonderful films. And we're kind of going to debate the relative merits of each studio. Jordan sort of has a preference for a lot of the Hammer material, and I've always been a big fan of the Universal stuff and less so of Hammer, although, as I said, we both enjoy both. So while we're framing this as a debate, it's important to say we're each a fan of the work that each studio has put out. So
each one definitely has one that's better than the other studios.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Creature from the Black Lagoon is Universal's great one, I would say.
Yep.
And that trumps all of Hammer stuff. Same with Wolfman, that trumps all of Hammer stuff. But
yeah.
You never hear people talk about Hammer that much when they're talking about the great films. It's kind of weird because I don't even remember which one of us came up with the idea for this.
I don't know. It definitely it's grown out of, I feel like, like this podcast. It's grown out of discussions that we've had often because I don't know why we always feel it necessary to compare Hammer to Universal, but it always seems like
it's
when
kind
we
of apples and oranges.
Yeah, it always seems like we do have these sorts of discussions, and I've always been more on the Universal side. You've always been more on the Hammer side,
but I mean, it is apples and oranges, but they do seem kind of like the natural comparison to each other.
Yeah.
You never hear people talk about it. That's why I think this is kind of interesting to do.
They each tackle a lot of the same
literally
stories.
The same stories.
Like, there's Hammer's version of Frankenstein, there's Universal's version of Frankenstein. They each have their version of Dracula, and they each have like big fan followings. And so classic horror from Hammer and Universal are what we're going to be talking about tonight. And in preparation for this episode, we rewatched two entries from each studio, kind of comparing them and setting up against each other. So we watched, we had two double features. We watched The Horror of Dracula, yep, along with the original Universal Studios Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. And then tonight we watched The Curse of Frankenstein from Hammer, yep, and then we also watched The Bride of Frankenstein, Universal's great horror film starring Boris Karloff and Elsa Lanchester. So those are kind of the main movies we'll be focusing on.
Well, they're like the biggest, discussion, most famous characters that
yeah.
they have.
So we'll be focusing specifically on those movies in our discussion, but probably talking a little bit generally about what we like about Hammer and Universal.
Probably more in general because they're kind of, I don't want to say forgettable, but going back through them, I kind of did notice that they're a little slow in a lot of parts, mm-hmm, on both sides. I recommend all these Hammer films to you. Sit down and start watching them, and I'm like, why did I recommend this again? Mm-hmm. Like, oh, no, like there's a lot of elements to it that I like. Particularly, I just like the look of them.
Okay.
The stories are not necessarily more creative than the Universal ones. In fact, Universal probably has more creative stories. Like I was talking about, the Creature from Black Lagoon. That's like their only original one, I guess, if you don't count all like the little sequels.
Yeah.
Where they team up and meet each other,
yeah,
like the.
Yeah. Well, it's their only real original monster. I mean, they came up with the Wolfman, but I mean, obviously there are werewolves and things.
But
like
I mean,
that.
the sequel stories, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. Those aren't like Mary Shelley obviously didn't write that.
Well, right,
and Bram Stoker didn't
yeah,
write
Yeah, but they're still using, characters that they didn't necessarily invent, whereas Creature from the Black Lagoon, they invented whole cloth, their own monster that really stands alongside, Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula. And the Creature from the Black Lagoon is an interesting Universal movie. I always kind of
It's funny to talk more about that one than the ones that we're supposed to be talking about. But
right. Well, I always kind of think of it as kind of, it came a lot later in the cycle of Universal
movies. It was a 3D
movies.
one, I think, too.
Yep, it was originally in 3D. And it came a lot later in the cycle of the classic kind of Universal era. It could be considered kind of the last real Universal monster movie. And I always think of it as kind of a bridge from the horror era of Universal, when they were really known as the House of Horror,
like their B
into like the
movie,
science
sci-fi.
fiction era, with things like This Island Earth and things like that. So Creature from the Black Lagoon is kind of, I feel like, a kind of transitional work for Universal, but most people consider it, to be part of that classic
the
horror
Universal
era.
ones are probably more culturally significant.
I think so, at least for Americans. I mean, they're American.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
American.
I was like, at least for us, because I think one of the reasons why you like them is because you're always like, well, when I think of Dracula, I picture the Dracula scene
and I
in
think,
the original.
and I think most people do.
I do
when you
too,
think of
but-
Frankenstein, you're thinking of.
But I'm an
some
American who
variation.
grew up in America watching
Yeah.
those. Like, I don't know if I would have the same opinion if I grew up in London.
Yeah, I suspect
Maybe
that
I would, because the Universal ones were obviously bigger successes.
Yeah, and I suspect that since they were earlier, like Universal's was like 1930s into 1940s, and then kind of, dwindling off into the 1950s. Hammer did their stuff later.
Like late 50s.
Yeah, in the late 50s. So I think, since Universal, while these characters existed in literature before Universal adapted them, and in many cases had been adapted to film, and in some cases, Universal really put their stamp on it, and they really created what the popular image of Frankenstein. Like, when you think of Frankenstein, when anyone thinks of Frankenstein, regardless of whether you've seen the Universal version of Frankenstein,
Yeah, you think of Herman
whether
Munster
or not you know
Frankenstein.
who Boris Karloff is, whether or not you know who Jack Pierce, who created a lot of the makeup for these creatures, is.
Which you do.
Yes, but even if you're not into Universal per se, it's their image of Frankenstein that's in your head. It's their image of Dracula. It's their image of
I agree.
the Wolfman and the Mummy. So I think for cultural impact, Universal is definitely,
But even
more
not,
significant.
even
than
not
Hammer.
just like a visual impact, because what you're talking about, like Creature from the Black Lagoon being a bridge between those movies, that really kind of made a statement about what was going on at the time.
Uh-huh.
And
I see.
don't, not just visually, like what you think of when you first. hear the name.
They're more culturally relevant.
They actually impacted, more cultural relevant. I don't know, just because when you said that, I had never even thought of that before, but I can't really point to an equivalent of a Hammer one that would do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think the cultural significance is of, like, Creature from the Black Lagoon?
Well, you kind of pointed it out, where it signifies
Oh, it's kind of a transition into...
kind of an era, something that was going on in the culture.
Yeah.
I don't know, was it a big success?
I
think
assume
it
so,
was.
since it had 2 sequels, 3 sequels.
Yeah. And then those just kind of died off and then went in a whole nother direction.
Yeah, it's, science fiction started to be kind of the popular trend at that time.
That's kind of weird, because then science fiction took over in America around the same time that the horror was taking off in London. There's a point in there somewhere.
So, more culturally kind of significant, impactful, I think, the Universals. But visually, you like the look of the Hammer movies, which are...
I do.
Technicolor is the one thing I always think of when I think of
I think
Hammer
of the
movies.
blood.
Yeah, very
Blood is
red
like
blood.
red.
Well, and Hammer is more, for horror fans today, the Universals probably seem very restrained and quaint, and for a certain kind of horror fan, unfortunately, they might seem a little boring and dated. Now, I love them, and I love the old style of filmmaking, and I think there's a lot to be said for the kind of restraint that was imposed upon them because of the standards at the time. But Hammer was not about restraint or suggestion. Hammer was about blood and sex, and they really kind of put it all on screen. Now, again, for today's audiences, it probably seems fairly
That
tame.
makes me sound horrible that I prefer that one
Right.
over
Well, no, but I think a lot they still seem a lot more modern, even though the boundaries have been pushed
They
a lot.
took more
further.
risks.
Yeah, and that they were really out to just kind of, they wanted to show the blood. They wanted to.
Well, the best part, the best point I could probably make in this so-called debate is that I always think when I'm watching the Universal ones, in high school and then you would go to a play that they were discussing in school, like you read the book and then you go, it's
Right.
a big field trip and you go watch the play.
Yeah, you read the play
and
and
you
then
don't
you
want to
watch it.
be there. You're just glad you're not in school. And you watch it on, you can't help but just, completely make fun of it either out loud or in your mind. Just because they're just people walking from one corner of the set to the other. There's a plastic tree that keeps falling down. I kind of feel that way about the Universal ones.
Really?
I do.
Wow.
It's like even Dracula. I like the movie.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it doesn't evoke the same kind of feeling. It evokes something a little more plain and, dare I say, boring.
Yeah. Well, Dracula is probably the worst offender for being. I mean, no one could say that movie is not slow paced. It is slow paced. It's that the Universal's movie is based directly on a stage version of Dracula.
Yes,
and
that's exactly what it looks
like. It is like
It looks
a
like they
filmed
filmed the stage.
play. So that one I'll grant you. The other movies, though, I don't think necessarily.
Frankenstein's like that though too.
Well, I don't know. I think a lot of that is has a lot to do with just the way that film has evolved over time.
Yeah, I mean,
and the
I need to
pace
say,
of film
I need to
has
say that I'm
changed
not
over time.
someone that needs to be completely like stimulated all the time
No.
by bright lights and stuff. Like I like
Right.
slower independent films as well. When you're talking about something horror and something that's supposed to be scary and exciting, I think you kind of need something else. It works in Dracula because it's scary because it is slow.
Well, and the one thing that
there's
Universal-
an armadillo there for some
Right.
reason. It's just kind of creepy.
And also I think you have to talk about the atmosphere that's created by these Universal movies. There's a very spooky, very otherworldly atmosphere
That
to
one's
these
a good
Universal
example.
movies, and the makeup is part of that. The acting is part of that, especially Bela Lugosi's just out of nowhere bizarro performance as Dracula in the original Dracula. The wonderful sets on the Universal lot, which just look gorgeous in the black and white photography.
Oh, wonderful sense, but
I think so. You don't think Dracula's castle in that original movie when?
no, I do. But I mean, I think it looks like a castle. I mean, but
Oh, I just love it. I love the gothic
but that's all there is in the
otherworldly
movie.
architecture.
They don't
to
go
it.
anywhere.
Yeah.
Nothing really happens.
Well, yeah, but you've also got to put yourself into the context of the time in which the movie came out. Like when I watch these movies, like when I sit down and watch Dracula, and I know in my head that this was the original. This was the first time audience saw Bela Lugosi as Dracula. I kind of like to try and put myself in that mindset of like, I try to forget that I know anything about Dracula, and just seeing it unfold on the screen for the first time, you realize how powerful these stories are and why they did have such an impact. Does that kind of make sense? Like you kind of have to.
I think so.
You kind of have to
might be
forget
kind of
what you know.
That might be kind of the root of our problem is that you kind of watch them in context with what was going on at the time. I know you say you kind of like separate it, but that's almost impossible.
Yeah. You try to go into it fresh.
You're looking more at the cultural significance
Right.
of it, I think, and I'm not.
Yeah.
Even though that was my point earlier.
Well, and I think one thing you like about the Universals is that because your image of Frankenstein, every kid's image of Frankenstein growing up is not the Christopher Lee Frankenstein from Curse of Frankenstein, which is a very bizarre looking, frightening character. So when you watch the Hammer movie and you see that, it seems more unique to you. It seems more interesting. But
because the Frankenstein, by that point, Frankenstein one had been played out. I mean, for God's sake,
Yeah.
there's the Munsters. You know, you had Herman Munster.
yeah, it's
who
been
looked exactly like-
exactly. Frankenstein wasn't
They
scary
They
anymore.
flooded the market with these characters.
Yeah, Frankenstein was friendly. But
especially in that one that we watched.
well, yes, and I definitely want to get into Bride of Frankenstein a little bit
All right.
too, because you were underwhelmed with it. But I had a point I was going for.
I'm sorry.
But you've got to, I think, you've got, and if you're evaluating them as films, you've got to give props to the movie that created such appealing, indelible, and sometimes even frightening images of these characters that they were able to have that kind of cultural impact.
But if that's the case, then you can never top them.
I don't think you can top them. I think they're some of the greatest horror movies of all time.
Well, that's not really fair. Just because they were first to the party doesn't mean
no, not just because they were first to the party. Because Nosferatu came out before Dracula, but the image of Nosferatu did not grab people to the extent that Bela Lugosi's Dracula did. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'm sure there had been...
I don't know if it could, because something else had already... I don't know. I'll use a weird analogy. Is that Christianity?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
We've already gone way off topic. I don't think we're ever on topic.
Well, it's kind of a small point, but
okay.
Is that any new religion that comes along, Scientology or whatever, they're all just looked at as ridiculous, whereas they're all kind of ridiculous. But the new one is looked at because it seems like it's just a copy of it. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then, the Hammer one, you can't start over again. Christianity was first to the party.
Right.
So you can't start over. You can only use what people know already. So Hammer, going by what you're saying, there's no way that their movies could have topped Universal ones. Yeah. I know you say they don't, but they didn't have a choice. There was no chance of topping them. I think some of them do. I mean, it's...
Well, okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about, film to film. What Hammer film do you think is legitimately superior to maybe a Universal equivalent of the movie? And they're not, Hammer did its own things. Universal, it's not like it's a 1-to-1 ratio.
Right.
But,
there's a lot of comparisons.
There is. Where's the point where you can say this is where Hammer clearly improved on what Universal did? Because all those Hammer filmmakers were very aware of the Universal movies.
The Horror of Dracula, I think, is a better film.
Okay.
It's more entertaining, I guess. I could say.
Because it has a quicker pace.
Yeah, although it was a lot slower than I had remembered it.
But a lot quicker than Dracula.
But yeah, and I don't know. Maybe I just have more of a morbid sense. I mean, I was talking about the original Dracula as a filmed play.
Yes.
Which it works. I don't want to say I didn't like that movie. I liked it, but
no, I think that's a legit criticism.
But then in Horror of Dracula, then the very first scene it says Horror of Dracula, and they have this red blood just splatters on it.
Right.
And for 1956, whatever.
Right.
That, if you're looking at it in cultural significance, that's a bold statement.
It is. Contrasted with Universal Dracula, there's literally one drop of blood in the entire movie, and it's when Renfield pricks his finger.
Yeah,
but that's it. In Dracula, you don't see any. There's no fangs in the Universal Dracula. Hammer right away made it clear, we're going to show the blood, we're going to show the we Was there nudity in Horror of Dracula?
No.
Hammer wasn't doing nudity yet, but they'd get to it.
What about Mr. Skin? I don't...
Well, we watched it recently, I just didn't know.
No, I don't think so.
Did or not.
It's more like the glamorous, voluptuous Hammer.
Yeah, but, Hammer was right away making it clear that they were going to... It would be a little bit more scintillating, be a little bit more explicit. So you think you like that more about Horror of Dracula? I mean, a lot of this
I do. I mean, that speaks to the atmosphere. I like the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And then in Curse of Frankenstein, which I think that probably is a better movie than Frankenstein, than Universal's.
Than Bride of Frankenstein?
Well, I was speaking about its direct equivalent.
Frankenstein, but the original Frankenstein.
I mean, you can get into Bride of Frankenstein, but the one scene in Curse of Frankenstein, Hammers, when they're hunting. Oh, there's a few scenes actually, but one where they're hunting him down. I love it that it takes place in the woods and it's fall. It just seems like a horror movie to me.
It seems like a Hammer movie.
I don't
they
know.
all take place in the woods.
I'm gonna reach a point where I can't explain why.
Okay.
But I like that and the scene where he attacks like the blind guy. I just like the looks of all those.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, do you? I mean, I think
not like it adds anything to the story or anything.
I think so much of this too comes down to preference. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if you like respond to the aesthetics of like the look of a Hammer movie more than you do to a Universal movie, like you can't really argue that. You know what I mean? And vice versa. If you just prefer the black and white kind of more otherworldly look of Universal.
Do you think one handles the stories better? Because they both seem to be kind of clunky in story department. We're just kind of talking about just the.
I would say that the Universal. Let's focus just on Frankenstein.
Universal can't do anything wrong.
No, they can. I said Dracula's slow paced, and I mean, if you start getting into the sequels with Universal,
it's the same with Hammer.
You start getting into a copy of a copy kind of situation. I mean, by the time they get into House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, while those movies are a lot of fun, I don't know that I can defend them as great films in the way that I can the earlier entries in those series.
Is that Frankenstein created woman?
From Hammer, which
From
I like
Hammer.
a lot. Yeah.
Or Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. Mm-hmm. That's a sequel that's really good.
Yeah, but that was earlier on this. I mean, I enjoy them all, but I do think it's a little bit of a diminishing returns. I don't think Son of Frankenstein is very good, not as good as Bride, but I do think if we look at like the first two Frankenstein movies, I think the story there is I think better than the Hammer Frankenstein that we just watched. One thing that I really enjoy about the Universals, and this is no great observation of mine, this is probably the most common observation that people have made about the Frankenstein movies, is that Frankenstein's monster himself, brilliantly portrayed by the incomparable Boris Karloff, is such an appealing character in his own right. And especially in Bride of Frankenstein, such a character you have such sympathy for. That's completely absent in Curse of Frankenstein.
Yeah, but it's not like they were going for that.
Well, they weren't going for that, but maybe they should have gone for it, because I think it would have made it a more interesting movie. I mean, when we were watching Curse of Frankenstein just now, you commented, this movie could have used a little bit more characters. Yeah. And I think one of those characters could have been Frankenstein's creature, as they call it in the Hammer version, played by Christopher Lee, who, great as Dracula, but honestly, don't you kind of feel like anyone could have played Frankenstein's creature in that movie?
Yeah, I suppose.
Contrast that to Boris Karloff.
I don't know if that really like means anything in the big picture. If anybody could have played, I don't know if it was that.
Do you think anybody could have played Frankenstein's monster in Bride of Frankenstein?
I don't know. Probably.
I think Karloff.
I think Boris Karloff's a brilliant actor.
I think his portrayal in Bride of Frankenstein is brilliant, and I think James Whale's direction of that movie is brilliant. I love how they play the comedy of that character, the pathos of that character. I mean, I know, yes, and I know this doesn't work for you as much, but I honestly, and you're going to laugh at me, but the scene with the blind man and Boris Karloff, I find those scenes actually quite moving, and I think it's because of the way James Whale directed it. It's because of the way Boris Karloff plays it. You get no emotion out of that scene whatsoever. Really? It just seems silly to you? Okay. Well, there you go.
I did get a little choked up when they had the people in the little bottles, the people of Kandor. Yeah.
In Bride of Frankenstein. Dr. Pretorius.
Yes.
Dr. Pretorius, another great character, don't you think?
I mean, character, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's just very simple.
But I love the way the actor portrays him. I just think there's.
I don't know if these people are doing it on purpose.
Oh, I think they are.
Really?
No, I think they absolutely are.
I think the comedy really falls flat, man.
Well,
I don't know if it's just because it's from like whatever 50 years ago.
Some of the overt comedy doesn't work as much, like with the annoying woman, and you know what I mean.
Well, that's a no-brainer, but
yeah,
I mean even the stuff with.
But the way that the actor who plays Dr. Pretorius kind of portrays that character, kind of like this effete,
queer.
Yes.
They said he was queer.
Well, we could have a whole podcast on the queer subtext of the Frankenstein movies, but we'll save that for. I'm serious. And of course, James Whale was a homosexual director, but we'll save that for another
I didn't know that.
podcast. Oh yeah, have you ever seen Gods and Monsters?
No.
Oh,
Fraser?
you should watch Gods and Monsters.
I know what it is, but I've never
Needless
seen it.
to say, I think the actors in this movie, James Whale, the director of the first two Frankenstein movies, knows exactly what they're doing.
Yeah,
And
I don't have a point, but I want to make it sound like I know a lot about Hammer movies. So the equivalent of James Whale is the guy Terrence Fisher. Well, you gave the answer, so now I don't look quite as smart. But yeah, okay, that's it.
Well, I have to say,
that's no story.
I don't know a lot about Hammer.
I think they're both really talented directors.
But what I like about James Whale's movies and Bride of Frankenstein, I think Bride of Frankenstein is the best of the Universal movies. So it's kind of like what I point to as the best of the examples. Yeah, I do. And I like...
You're just so emotionally wrapped up in that comedy lady.
No,
screaming.
But I do... I'm emotionally involved to an extent with Karloff's monster in that movie. And I think it's really cool what James Whale did and Boris Karloff did, making that character so sympathetic and having that character evolve in the way that he does in the movie, and decide to save decide to save Henry Frankenstein at the end of the movie and kill himself and Pretorius. I mean, it's just a great story. I honestly think Bride of Frankenstein is one of the great American films.
It is, but because it was the first of the party, they don't do as many creative things with it, I don't think. He literally says, "You die, you live."
But that's creative. If you look at the original Frankenstein story, I mean, the original story...
I've never read the original.
Right, but I mean, the original story is the monster kills the doctor. I mean, that was the first Frankenstein movie. In the second Frankenstein movie, they evolve that character.
But the doctor is alive in the second one?
Yeah. I mean, he was like killed,
presumed dead.
Yeah, but then it turned out he wasn't really dead for the sequel. Whatever.
He was just sleeping.
Yeah, but whatever. I mean, they they evolve the Frankenstein character so that he makes a different decision at the end of Bride of Frankenstein.
No, I get that. It's not
He's evolved as a character. I mean,
I
think that's a cool thing to take a movie monster. The greatest of movie monsters.
And take away everything that's scary about him.
Well, no, but to evolve him into like a close to a three-dimensional kind of character who the audience has sympathy for. More sympathy for the monster than they do for, like Dr. Pretorius, who's like the true monster in that movie.
Yeah, I see your point.
Yeah.
It is just kind of what you're looking to get out of it.
Yeah.
I'm not really looking for that. If that stuff happens to me,
I just find it hugely entertaining. I mean, it's an entertaining movie.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I wouldn't use the word entertaining.
I am surprised you didn't like Bride of Frankenstein more. I think it's terrific.
It's weird because I keep hearing about that one. Like, it's such a big...
Well,
I've seen a lot of other classic movies. Pretty much like, probably the top 100 greatest movies ever made.
Mm-hmm.
But then you always hear of Bride of Frankenstein, and every time I watch it, I've only seen it twice now, but when I watch it, I don't get it. I don't think it's a bad movie.
And see, that's how I am a lot of times with Hammer, honestly. I'm like, okay, it's good, it's well done, but I'm like, what is so wonderful about Hammer? I just don't see what they bring to the party that hasn't already been contributed by Universal and other studios.
But if you're just looking at that, then, I don't know if they did bring a lot. They use the same stories.
Yeah.
They try to do different creative things. If you start watching some of the sequels, the creativity exists in the gaps between the stories that they have, where they had nothing to go on. They just have a name and a character.
Right.
There's Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, where they put the brain in some weird kind of...
Yeah.
I don't know what he is. He's like a caveman or an inmate that they have locked up. That's a really freaky looking monster. There's Frankenstein Created Woman, where he puts the Frankenstein mind, not an actual brain, but it's like a spiritual thing almost.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm remembering that right. Into the body of a beautiful Playboy model, and she goes around killing people with an axe.
That sounds good.
Now that's a great movie. I love that one. You don't see anything like that from Universal, really.
Right.
You see, we'll put two of them in the same movie together and they'll fight. Which
Yep. True.
the 12-year-old inside of me is like, that's awesome. Like, I want to see that, and that's okay. I like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman.
Yeah.
But I think, I don't know. I was going somewhere with that, but
No, I see what you're saying. There's a perhaps a dearth of creativity, at least in some of the sequels. But I think in the same way that you don't think it's necessarily fair for me to give credit to Universal just because they were the first, I think you are kind of indirectly criticizing them because they were the first. Because
I'm just trying to like remove it from that,
right?
Even though it's impossible to do, but as much
it
as
is.
I can.
But as much as you can, to you, Hammer seems more creative with what they did. But if you can ignore the fact that Universal had such cultural impact, like they were as creative with their initial entries into each of those series as Hammer was. It's just that because Universal was first and so successful, that by the time we get around to watching these movies, we already have those images in our head. So what Universal did doesn't seem so creative when you sit down and watch the movie. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I mean, for Universal to decide, for like Jack Pierce to work with Boris Karloff and to create the Frankenstein makeup and to say it's going to look like this, Frankenstein is going to act like this, that was radically creative. That was new.
A lot of that's in the book, though, too, right?
No, the Frankenstein book is very different. Frankenstein doesn't.
I mean, Frankenstein. I know in the book he's not like a monster.
No, he's a monster, but he's very articulate.
Not the way you would think
quotes
a monster.
Milton. He doesn't look. I mean, the Frankenstein monster, as it appears in the Universal movies, was essentially an original creation. I think Universal has to be given a lot of credit.
I agree.
For that.
The proof is in the pudding. It wouldn't be around. You wouldn't know what it looks like. Everybody watching this and the rest of the country that is now watching this, the other 3 billion, they wouldn't know what that looks like. Everybody knows what Frankenstein looks like if it wasn't creative.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just because it was first.
Right.
It's because it was terrific. It was fantastic. It was really well done.
They handled it right. They handled it the right way.
So I think they should get as many points for creativity as Hammer does. I think Hammer might seem more creative and more original, ironically, because their stuff did not have as much of an impact culturally as they're known among horror fans and fans of those kind of movies and people who grew up when they were coming out and liked those kind of movies. Yeah. But they didn't create the kind of cultural images that Universal did. But in a weird way, I feel like you're kind of giving them credit for that because when you go to see those movies now, you're like, oh, I've never seen a Frankenstein that looked like that. It's like, well, that's because it didn't have the impact that Universal did, But that doesn't necessarily mean it's better or any more creative, Yeah.
I mean, they do things with these stories all the time and they go nowhere. There was the new Wolfman that came out.
Yeah.
That just it wasn't terrible, but I mean, it faded away. Mm-hmm. That stuff comes and goes all the time. I've been watching Hammer movies for a long time now, and I still enjoy watching them. There's a reason why
watching the Universal movies.
A reason why they stick around as well. So
yes,
they both are equal on that point, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe this debate is a draw between Hammer and Universal.
I'll concede that.
But speaking of the new Wolfman movie, it's interesting to consider. Do you think that have these kind of classic characters, Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, etc., have they been successfully interpreted by other studios? Or do you think it's possible that they ever will be? Or have Hammer and Universal pretty much put their stamp on these characters?
I would never say never.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, it's just that thing. They're first at the party. They got it.
Yeah. Between
if they would
have
have blown it, and they wouldn't have been as creative as they were, then yeah, you'd be able to. They would have gone away. The characters would have popped up in some other permutation,
right?
In the history of
or maybe people would still be waiting for the definitive Frankenstein movie in the way that like H.P. Lovecraft's work had never been like really, satisfactorily adapted to film. But Frankenstein, they will continue to make Frankenstein and Dracula movies,
of course,
but they maybe don't ever need to anymore. Because I don't know that I can think of any that have really been I mean, there's so many Dracula movies, but really great Dracula movies, really great Frankenstein movies that have had the impact that the Universal movies had.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Was it if Francis Ford Coppola directed the Dracula in the 1990s with Keanu Reeves?
Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a good movie.
Great movie, a really good movie. Probably noteworthy for skewing really close to the original novel.
You ever see Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? I've never seen that one. Was that any good?
I saw it, I was a kid when it came out, and I liked it at the time. I mean, I think I barely knew who Robert De Niro was. I just liked Frankenstein, and I remember liking it. Although I think critically it's sort of been panned, so it's probably not that good. I'd have to go back and.
Because people are just comparing it to the Universal.
Revisit it. Yeah, it's probably way past time to retire Dracula and Frankenstein, but of course they never will be retired.
No, I'm glad they don't.
Yeah,
I mean, you can retire the idea that Universal did, and it's because every time they come out with a story, they're just like, how can we readapt to the same exact story instead of doing creative things with it? That's why, I think Hammer does that a little better.
Yeah.
They don't follow the script beat for beat as much as the Universal ones do.
Yeah, that is true. They really do kind of try to go their own way. Yeah. They don't, they're Frankenstein.
It's not even that, they're more creative or less creative than Universal. It's just that they're doing something completely different.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Even Bram Stoker's Dracula, the big selling point of that was, of course, that it's really faithful to the Bram Stoker's original story. But they could have just taken the name Dracula and just done anything with it.
Mm-hmm. And you feel like that's
and I think that would have made a little more impact.
What Hammer does.
And I think that's probably a better comparison to what Hammer does. I feel like Universal probably would make something. They'd probably want to go directly out of the book, and if they can't do it, then maybe eliminate it. Mm-hmm. That's why they look so simple. Because I have a feeling this is weird because I've never read any of those two original stories. I think it'd be interesting to compare the stories to, just because of what maybe they left out. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so Universal, their stories are really stripped down. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of why I think they make more of an impact, because you know the entire story by watching it one pass through. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to explain some of the Hammer ones. Even I don't remember exactly. All I remember is watching it, I was like, that's pretty awesome. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. That's my point.
Yeah, well said. Well, I don't know nearly as much, but I'm really a dilettante when it comes to Hammer. I've really only seen a few.
What's a dilettante?
Kind of like a dabbler. I've only seen a few. I'm not an expert in Hammer in the way that I don't know. I'm not really an expert in Universal, but I've seen a lot of the movies multiple times. He's pointing to, we have our DVDs of Hammer and Universal way back on our shelf where no one can see, but I have the...
How much did that set you back?
It was not too bad. It was I have the Blu-ray set of 8 of the classic Universal movies on Blu-ray that they just released. I think it was $150 from Amazon or something
pretty
like
good,
that. $130 to $150 range is what I paid for it. I don't know. The list price is more than
not
that.
Not bad.
Yeah. So anyway, I know the Universal movies well. I don't know the Hammer movies as well. I'm looking forward to digging more into Hammer and learning more about them. Because,
so I convinced you.
Yeah, and like we said at the beginning of the debate, this was just more of a barely coherent discussion, than an actual debate that anyone would be interested in.
We'll have notes next time.
Yeah, but, we said at the beginning, we both think both studios are great. If Universal is in fact the greatest horror movie studio of all time, which I think they are, Hammer is number 2. And if Hammer is in fact the greatest horror movie studio of all time, which Jordan thinks it is, but it isn't, then Universal is number 2. So we both like both. So. Right?
I agree.
Okay.
That was some debate.
All right, yeah. So I'm just going to say I won.
All right.
And we'll wrap it up.
I will say, don't forget your coat.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
Okay. So thanks for sticking with us. This seemed like it was going to be a good idea to debate the relative merits of the two studios. So I hope you got something out of it. So definitely, you guys can weigh in on your own opinions on what is better between Hammer and Universal in the comments, and talk about your own favorite movies from each studio, or just tell us how much we suck or whatever. We appreciate every view and every comment. So thanks so much, and until next time, we will see you later.
Maybe with a name.
Yes, maybe we'll have a name for our podcast. Bye.